Hey, how are you?
Hey, I am doing great. I just got back from our sermon prep team, and it was just so much fun today because instead of diving in and talking about a text like we normally do, we had one of our preaching team stand up in the auditorium with just us scattered around the room, listening to them practice their sermon and giving feedback on their manuscript, their delivery, all of that. And it was so much fun to see all the different voices come together in support of the one who is speaking, and all of the feedback that is just going to take a great sermon and make it even that much better. It's just so fun to be a part of.
It is such an amazing process. I don't know of anybody else in my particular sphere who is part of a communal preaching team like this. And every time you talk about it, I just think it's fascinating and so good.
Yes. And I think it really speaks to the maturity and the wisdom of our senior pastor and the way that he puts this team together and runs this. Like it just, it's so good. I just don't know that a lot of other contexts could pull it off as well as he does.
Yeah, that totally makes sense. Well, and there's a grace and a humility that is required to lead that kind of a thing that one hopes for in Christian leaders, but hoping for and actually experiencing aren't always the same. But he clearly has that sort of comfort in his own skin that he's more than happy to like subject himself to that kind of microscope, I guess.
Well, and he models that so well so that the other members of the preaching team who have less experience behind the pulpit can, take a day like this and practice their sermon in front of the group and know that they will be supported and encouraged and also will get really quality, good feedback.
That's
It's
amazing.
cool.
It's just amazing. That's so cool.
So, how about you?
I am doing quite well. I feel like I'm constantly in a state of impatient waiting as I'm shifting my coaching to more of a side thing. I'm looking at a variety of different jobs, and so last week I had a really fun interview with a company here in Springfield that is looking for really someone to be a day-to-day chaplain for their employees, which I thought would be super.
Mm.
So yeah, I've been applying for a bunch of different places, and so that is a both exciting and it gets my imagination going, and places are wildly slow to hire. I mean, several of the places I'm applying are in the higher education arena, and they are posting jobs now for like August
Wow.
because that's their kind of rhythm. And so the process for them is so slow. Um,
Yes, I can only imagine. And, based on what you have shared on the podcast to date, I don't think you really want slow at this point.
you know, I have said to several people that when they think of folks from the Northeast and particularly from Boston, probably what they think of is laid back, slow kinds of people. So obviously that sort of
Oh,
thing comes naturally to me. Yeah.
oh boy. Um, I'm sorry to take so much mirth in your description there. Uh,
It is okay, but it is what it is. It has been a really spiritually fruitful time, even in the midst of the impatience. So that's great.
yeah, yeah. Well, let's dive in today to our misquoting Paul topic. For those who may have caught us last week, you will know we are in a brief little mini series on different passages of Paul's that are misquoted, misapplied, misused. And today, I think we're going to get into a topic that I think most listeners would go, I didn't know there was even a debate here.
No, absolutely. I think there is a commonly assumed interpretation. And this is one of the things that's fascinating to me as we go, is that there is a divide between, I think most academics think one thing, most common folks in the proverbial stacking chair think another thing. And right.
The proverbial stacking chair. I just love how you wouldn't say pew. It was brilliant. It was a nice little turn of phrase.
um, it's just interesting to me that the divide is there.
Yeah, exactly. You're exactly right. So, for those who skipped past the title and just decided to listen to us no matter what we talked about, this is Paul's famous passage in Romans 7. And I'll go ahead and read a little bit here. This is Romans 7:14 through 20. And so Paul picks up, he says, "For we know that the law is spiritual, but I am of the flesh, sold under sin. For I do not understand my own actions. For I do not do what I want, but I do the very thing I hate. Now, if I do what I do not want, I agree with the law that it is good. So now it is no longer I who do it, but the sin that dwells in me. For I know that nothing good dwells in me, that is, in my flesh. For I have the desire to do what is right, but not the ability to carry it out. For I do not do the good I want, but the evil I do not want is what I keep on doing. Now, if I do what I do not want, it is no longer I who do it, but sin that dwells in me." And so this is Paul supposedly wrestling with sin. And so this is Paul speaking from the first person. This is my experience wrestling with the sin nature. And we tend to interpret this, one, as Paul speaking about himself, and two, as therefore us speaking about ourselves as Christians struggling with our sin nature. Is that pretty much how you understand it as well?
Yeah, I think generally speaking, yeah.
So what's interesting to me is that I think most people sitting in the proverbial stacking chair says, yeah, well, that's what it means to wrestle with having a sin nature. And scholars come along and say, actually, I don't think Paul's talking about himself here. When he says I, he's taking on a caricature or he's taking on a persona. He's using a rhetorical device to talk about some mythical I. Now, we could point to all sorts of different ideas as to who is this I, but either way, he's really just pointing to I as though a persona. Almost like what we would do if we quoted a song lyric. So like if I told you right now, I knew you were trouble when you walked in, shame on me now. Like, I think most people would recognize the song lyric and go, oh, he's not actually telling Josh from Missouri that he thinks he was trouble when he walked in. And
So
so
I'm going to go on record as not knowing what song you just quoted. So
your daughter knows.
is it a Taylor Swift song?
It sure is.
Oh, well then, daughter of mine, if you're listening to this, I'm sorry that I missed a Taylor Swift quiz question.
Daughter of mine, if you're listening, that's the only Taylor Swift question I'm going to be able to get. Yeah.
Yeah, but I think you're exactly right. Quoting, or a lot of times, our formal convention is to say one, right? One might think that. But in common everyday conversations, we use the word you for this. We'll say, you would do whatever, whatever. And we don't actually mean the person we're talking to. We mean just the theoretical human.
I think so sometimes, but I'll tell you what, here's one example from my personal life where I totally dive into this I as though I were talking from another's perspective. I do this all the time with my dogs. And I will take on, we have a doofy dog. We have two dogs. One is the emasculating schnoodle, schnauzer poodle mix. And so don't say that and, feel masculine. But then we also have a silky, which is a silver Yorkie. And if you've ever been around a Yorkie or a silky, they are doofy, dumb dogs. They do the goofiest things. And so His name is Charlie, but we call him Sir Charles Einstein Sausage Legs because he's just one of those dogs you just live to make fun of. And so when he does something dumb, I take on the Charlie voice and I just start talking like I'm him. Oh, yeah, I didn't know. Okay. You know, like you just, and I speak as though I'm Charlie using the I, but I changed my tone of voice. And so y'all understand what I'm saying. It's harder to do in print.
Yes, it absolutely is. But there are times when I think this sort of natural jump, in your case, it's to a particular eye, right? You're jumping to the vantage point of the dog. But in some sense, I think that particularly when you're talking about faith and theology, there is a natural need at times to jump to a universal eye. And the two things, because the question would be, so why doesn't Paul say people in general or something like that? And
Mm,
we haven't even argued which way we actually think this is going yet. But one of the reasons I think this makes sense is that there is a deeper emotional connection in using the word I that allows the reader to find him or herself more emotionally in the text when it says I than whether it were to say you or people in general.
yeah, I think you're exactly right. That's a great observation. So last week we talked about how if we're going to do these, the way to find out what the true meaning of the text is through context. Context, 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 right? Context is
Mm-hmm.
king. And so I think if we're really going to set the stage and try to understand what Paul is saying here when he's arguing, I don't know what I want to do and I don't do that and all of that. What is he really saying? We have to set the context. So I want to set the stage a little bit for why this book was written in the first place. And I'd love to just then turn it over to you if you wouldn't mind catching us up to speed with what has gone on in the book to date.
Sure. Yes,
All right.
and I'm glad you're going to set the stage because I think that that's really important.
Yeah, because this is a letter, right? And a letter has a particular occasion and a reason for it to be written, and a particular audience and a particular setting. And all of that plays a role in how we understand the letter. And as we look at the history in Rome and the history of the Roman Church, what originally was largely a Jewish sect of believing Jewish Christians kind of grew to include some Gentiles as well. And then in 49 AD, the Roman emperor kicked out all the Jews because he thought they did some horrible things and he was mad at them. So all the Jews had to leave Rome. And so the Roman church was really dominated for a number of years by Gentile believers. And so the Gentile believers had their own way of doing church, if you will. And they were not as encumbered by the Jewish customs and the Jewish law that maybe their Jewish brothers were.
Mm.
And so after the emperor died, the Jewish Christians started returning to Rome and reintegrating into these churches. Meanwhile, the Gentiles were like, yeah, this is the way we do things now. And the Jewish brothers and sisters are going, wait a minute, you guys are forgetting all about the laws and all the things that we're supposed to be practicing. And they're like, well, that's not relevant anymore. Yes, it is. No, it's not. Yes, it is. And so you have this division between Jew and Gentile believers in the church in Rome. And while that's happening, Paul is writing to this church saying, I am looking forward to coming and visiting you. I hope you will help me in my missionary endeavors move on to Spain, but I hope also to provide something that is of benefit to you. And as I look into your situation and the things that are going on in the church, I really want to encourage you to live in unity under the gospel. And so Paul lays out a long exposition that we know as the book of Romans to try to describe why Christ is above both Jew and Gentile, and why the law is nullified under the covenant of Christ, and why what the purpose for unity is, or what the basis for unity is within the church.
It's so good. And it's fascinating to see how Paul works these themes out. And as a matter of fact, it actually leads me into a kind of a story about how I got my outline that I want to talk through, which is just
Okay.
hilarious to me. Um, I am an avid user of ChatGPT. I have, I can't remember if it's 3 or 4 free accounts based on different email addresses. And I run out of usage every day on at least 3 of those accounts. So I use ChatGPT all the time. So I went into ChatGPT, and just as a starting point, I asked for an outline of Romans.
Hmm.
And so the outline it spit out to me was basically chapters 1 to 3 were the need for salvation. Chapters 3 to 5 were justification by faith. Chapters 6 to 8 were sanctification. So it's salvation, justification, sanctification. Then this sort of excursus in 9 to 11 on God's plan for Israel. Then at the end of the book, sort of application in 12 to 16. This is
Okay.
the exact outline I grew up with.
Really?
Yes. And I didn't like it. So I said to ChatGPT, okay, that's fine. But here's the thing that sounds like a really conservative, traditional evangelical reading of the book. If I were to take that lens off and perhaps focus more on Paul's Jewish background and the kind of milieu of Second Temple Judaism and the historical context of the book, would I find the same outline? And it started writing back and it said, no, you would not. To which I thought to myself, so why did you give me that outline in the first place?
That's so funny.
So let me tell you the second outline ChatGPT gave me, because
Okay.
and that's why I burned so fast through that first one, because I think that that's generally our understanding of Romans is salvation, justification, sanctification, interruption for something about Israel, application.
Yeah. Okay.
A-
Yeah, you're right.
And and backing off of that and looking at it from a more Jewish perspective, I found the outline ChatGPT gave very helpful. So the general outline it gives that brings us up to the point of the book we're in is that the first 4 chapters of Romans really are a statement of the need for God to redefine the concept of the people of God, because both Jews and Gentiles have failed to be the people of God. And so then there needs to be a new approach, which Abraham models for us in the way that he has faith that transcends the dichotomy between Jew and Gentile by bringing them both into kind of one group. And from there, Romans 5 through 8 focuses in on this new people of God, the new humanity of God. Romans 5 talking about how Adam introduced death and sin, but Jesus introduced this new era of reconciliation in life, and how we are baptized into that new people of God through baptism in Romans chapter 6. And then we finally get to Romans chapter 7, which is what we want to talk about.
Mm.
I
That
just found
outline
that
is so much better.
so much better, right?
Well, not only does it capture the Jewish perspective, which is integral to this letter because obviously it's being written to a partially Jewish audience and trying to articulate what the people of God means now under Christ. And so, yes, it needs that. But I also think it just mirrors Paul's argumentation far more accurately. I think the first outline was much more of a theological outline from an evangelical perspective, and much less the outline that Paul had in mind as he was progressing through the letter.
I totally agree. And I found the second outline to really be clarifying on some of the parts that often are confusing. So, for example, like when I get to Romans chapter 4 and suddenly we're talking about Abraham. Well, if I'm looking at that theological outline, Abraham is an odd jump from all have sinned to salvation is available in Jesus.
Mm.
Abraham is a perfectly reasonable jump from nobody is qualified to be called the people of God, neither Jew nor Gentile. Everybody has disqualified themselves. And yet, we have a history that tells us when there is no people of God, God can make a people for himself out of nothing, which is what he did with Abraham.
Well, and even in Paul's usage of Abraham, he's saying, look, and Abraham did not become the people of God because he was obedient to the covenant. He became the people of God because he believed in God and the message that God had given him. So he goes to great lengths to say, was Abraham blessed before or after circumcision? In other words, before he was obedient to the law or after he was obedient to the law? It was before. Belief is what makes us the people of God, not obedience to the law. So, which again helps understand why Abraham's being talked about at all.
Yeah, exactly. I think that that's fascinating. And it's amazing based on what you were talking about how Paul is writing to this broken Jew and Gentile audience, and with a particular emphasis to Jews, to say, look, the most Jewish Jew there is, Abraham, presents a model for us to understand ourselves all as one in Christ. That's incredible to me. And again, pulls that into me. This is an important text, not just a random, we've all preached in moments and maybe our illustration worked great in our original outline, but as the outline shifted, the illustration didn't. And so you're like, but you got to tell a story. So you're sticking the story in. Like, that's how I think sometimes we read this Abraham story. Well, he's just kind of shoehorning an illustration in. I don't think that's what's going on here. But that's not the text we're talking about today. All of this brings us up to Romans 7.
Well, so kind of, I think there's a piece that's missing, and
Sure.
we haven't really camped out on Romans 6 yet. And I think what's interesting about Romans 6 is, I don't know what your experience was. I had a really, when I decided to get baptized at like the age of 12, the entire preparation I got for baptism from the church was go read Romans 6. Oh, okay. I'll read Romans 6. It has to do with baptism, I guess. And so you read it and you're picking up, we know this now, but I didn't know this at 12 years old. I'm picking up right in the middle of Paul's letter, right in the middle of his argumentation. Everything that he's talked about, like all the context, all the stuff that we just laid out, I don't know any of that. All I know is this is supposed to teach me what baptism is. And so I read Romans 6. I understand about 3% of it. And I'm like, all right, dunk me. I'm ready. And so you referenced in your recap that Romans 6 talks about baptism. And I don't think you meant to be as reductive as my experience was, but that is to date the only thing that we've said about Romans 6. And I think really diving into what's going on in Romans 6 sets the stage for Romans 7.
I think you're exactly right. So I have all sorts of thoughts, but please jump into what you think Romans 6 is saying in the broader context of Romans and how that sets up for 7.
Yeah, I think if we don't have time to do this on the podcast, but if you get an opportunity to read Romans 6 and just reflect on the number of times that Paul uses imagery related to being free and absolute freedom from bondage of sin, and how we're dead to sin and alive to Christ, and all of this language that he used, it's very emphatic and repetitious to say, you are no longer enslaved to sin. You are free, you are free, you are free. How many different ways can I tell you you are free? Like a dead man is free from the chains that he was in, you are free. And so he continues to just harp on this. And so, for example, in verse 6, we know that our old self was crucified with him in order that the body of sin might be brought to nothing, so that we could no longer be enslaved to sin. For one who has died has been set free from sin. Skip down to verse 14. For sin will have no dominion over you, since you are not under law, but under grace. That's the emphasis that heartbeats its way throughout all of Romans 6. And I think when we come to Romans 7 and we deal with this moment where Paul speaks from the perspective of I, is that the normal Christian life then, to wrestle with sin to the degree that he talks about? Or does he position this mysterious I from a different vantage point, a pre-conversion, pre-Christ vantage point? And I think Romans 6 helps lead us a direction on that answer.
I think you are absolutely right. I think this is wildly important for Paul to be absolutely and passionately declaring the freedom that comes, not just there is a thing about salvation that means being free from sin. When I was really kind of skimming through all of this, what really caught my attention was coming off of the Abraham story and then Adam, the ways in which this feels like an Exodus moment in Paul's thinking, and how you couldn't have called the people of God free if they were still in Egypt being slaves, no matter what any piece of paper said.
Yes, exactly. Yes.
And not only that, but it was through the incredible suffering of the desert that they learned to live in their freedom, right?
Mm.
And so I think that this, for Paul, the experience of dying symbolized by baptism, and not dying physically, but participating in the death of Christ, becomes the sanctifying reality that then inaugurates freedom.
Yeah.
So, yes, I think all of this is so important. And so does that bring us then to Romans 7?
In my mind, it does.
Yeah, mine as well. So jump on in. Tell me what you think. What do you think these verses are saying?
So this is a lot of just complicated argumentation from Paul's perspective, let alone trying to dive into it in 40 minutes on a podcast, right? So I think what Paul has done is he's talked about how the law was not sufficient to save us, that Christ came and saved when the law couldn't. And so now he has to try to, he does this all throughout the book of Romans. Like, wait a minute. So does that mean the law was a bad thing? Is it like, what is sin? Like, no, the law wasn't a bad thing. It's just that like this big monster called sin, like saw the opportunity, like, oh, you know, that's wrong now. Great. Now I'm going to try to like make it so that you want to do that thing. And it's not like the law was bad, but sin was bad. It sees the opportunity from the law. And you're going, wow, okay, so how does this all fit together? And I think if we look at Romans 7, 5, and 6, a lot of scholars point to this as the thesis statement for the remainder of chapter 7 and all of chapter 8. So in other words, this encapsulates, this covers in really short form everything that he's going to try to lay out for the next chapter and a half. So chapter 7, verse 5, for while we were living in the flesh, our sinful passions, aroused by the law, were at work in our members to bear fruit for death. But now we are released from the law, having died to that which held us captive, so that we serve in the new way of the Spirit and not in the old way of the written code. So I think when we encounter the rest of chapter 7 and he uses this I statement, he's positioning the I, whoever that is, in that state of living in the flesh, our sinful passions aroused by the law that were in work in our members to bear fruit for death. He's trying to show evocatively, as you said before, what it was like to be in that pre-conversion state, knowing the law, but being completely unable to fulfill the law. And then when you turn the page to chapter 8, and you get to this glorious statement, but now there is no condemnation for those who are in Christ Jesus. And he goes on throughout the whole amazing chapter of 8 to talk about that we are more than conquerors through Christ. And all of this is behind us because of what Christ has saved us to. We start to see Paul's statement make sense within its larger context.
Yeah, it's funny. I came to this text bound and determined. We even talked earlier before we started recording that I needed to be absolutely like, I have never read a good argument for what you just said from the text. I've read plenty of theological arguments that really feel like the first ChatGPT outline,
Mm.
where it's like, yep, I know that you think that, and therefore you see that in the text. But starting with the text first, there are several things actually that have gotten me far more convinced that you may well be right. The first is what you were talking about in Romans chapter 6. Romans chapter 6, Paul creates a very strong divide between those who are under the law and those who have died to the law. And those who have died to the law are free from it, like you said. For Paul to back up and say, well, I said we were free, but we're not really free, would actually really
Yeah.
undermine his entire argument that he seems to be trying to make here.
Yes, exactly.
The other thing, and again, I'm just going to be honest, this is a ChatGPT comment that I thought was fascinating. When I asked ChatGPT about this, one of the comments it said is, well, one of the best things we can do is gather the various places where Paul talks about himself and see if taking this as the traditional first person, this is what I experience of myself, is consistent with any version of himself that Paul has ever described.
Ooh, yeah.
And ChatGPT goes on to remind me and us that this is not at all the Paul that we have ever seen. And this is what I think is interesting. Paul, before he is a Christian, before he starts following Jesus, does not identify himself as this kind of person. He identifies himself as, if there are any good among the Jews, I was the best of them. And if anybody is holy or worthy among the Jewish people, it's me. I have the pedigree. I did the work. I was literally killing the enemies of God who turned out to be Christians, and I was super wrong, but still. I mean,
Yeah.
I think if we say clearly Paul's not talking about his present experience, I think the way I have often heard this argument is he's talking about his past experience, and that doesn't ring true either. I don't think this is who Paul ever experienced himself to be in the traditional sense.
Right. No, I think he's personifying, a mixture of things. The different scholars that I've read kind of say he's probably personifying a conglomerate here. In part, he might be talking about Adam, which earlier he was referring to the sin coming through Adam, but the new Adam, Christ, gives life. And so it could be he's positioning himself as Adam before the law and how the law came and introduced sin and all of that. But then it could be, in part, he's personifying Israel and Israel's experience of trying to uphold the law. And other things are postulated as well. So I tend to lean that direction, that this is not biographical of Paul at all, whether his present or his past.
Yeah, I think if as I read this, and maybe this is kind of what you're saying as well, particularly in the context of the larger book of Romans, in which Paul is trying to bring unity to these two groups of people, the Jews and the Gentiles, in a local church context. Part of when I look at Romans 6 and read Romans 7 through the lens of Romans 6, it appears to me he is talking about people who have not died to sin yet, which means they have not participated in the death of Jesus on the cross yet. And therefore, I wonder if he's really talking about the groups of people, the same way Romans 1 and 2 create a theological argument for why everybody needs a savior. This almost feels like the evocative personal argument. Here's something you can all relate to, that everybody needs Jesus. And the argument sort of sweeps everybody in and then brings us to 24, again, in this beautiful writing that you can't help but feel your own life in. And then for 24 to say, "Wretched man that I am, who will deliver me from this body of death?" Paul has brought, whether believing or not believing, whether remembering the past or being in it in the present, he has brought everybody to this one point of acknowledging, oh, yes, I need something. Again, this unifying idea of faith that we saw in his story of Abraham and then earlier in his theological arguments in 1 through 3. Does that make any kind of sense?
It really does. It really does. I think you're exactly right. I would argue pretty stridently that this is talking about not the normal everyday experience of a Christian. Because of all that he has said in chapter 6 and will go on to say in chapter 8, I think it is incongruous with his larger argument to think that Paul would conceive of this level of wrestling being possible within the normal Christian life. I think, in preparation for this episode, I remember that my seminary professor, Dr. Joey Dodson, had so much to say on this passage. And so I went and looked for anything on the internet with Joey Dodson to talk about this. And I found a great podcast episode that he did with Disciple Dojo. J.M. Smith is the host there. And if you have the time, I encourage you to check it out. One, Joey is an amazing person to watch and engage with. He is the poster child of an ADHD youth pastor turned scholar. And he has the brain of a scholar and everything else screams ADHD youth pastor. It's just amazing to listen to him talk. So, but at any rate, he had so many great quips in that podcast episode. One of them really encapsulates what I think about this text as well. With freedom like this, who needs bondage? So in other words, if this is talking about the normal Christian life, I do what I don't want to do and what I don't want to do, I do, and all of this wrestling, and it's just sin is living inside of me and I can't help it. I don't understand. I can't get free. With freedom like this, who needs bondage? And I think it's just so incongruous with Paul's larger argument that it's clear to me that he's positioning the I, not as Paul, now or before, and not as some metaphorical Christian, but as somebody pre-Christ, coming to the point of abject need for Christ.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and the thing that I think is interesting about this, first of all, I have heard these verses used by a host of parishioners over the years. Like I remember one guy talking to me and he was really struggling with a sin issue in his life. And as we sat there and talked, he referred to these verses and they gave him hope, right? Like, I struggle, but at least I know I'm not the only one who struggles.
Mm.
But the flip side of this, and what I think is really dangerous, I remember talking to one woman, and I wish I could remember her name. This was early on in my pastoral career, but she was a heroin addict. We had talked about getting her into a recovery program. I had offered literally to do all of the work. Like, I was going to call the program, and I did. We were going to buy her a bus ticket to get to the program, all the things. And I remember sitting there, and we had just bought this new building that we were renovating, a factory we were renovating. And so I'm sitting in this room that has like unpacked boxes all over the place. And she's sitting in one metal folding chair, and I'm sitting in another metal folding chair. And we've been talking for an hour and a half, 2 hours, and she has been very transparent about how desperately she needs to get out of this life that is sucking the life out of her. And with all of that, I remember asking her as she's walking out the door, "So where are you headed now?" Is where, you've got to do these three things. She had to get like a document from the court and all the couple of things. And then I'll get you the bus ticket and off you go. So she's got the weekend to do those things. I said, "So where are you headed?" She said, I'm going to see my dealer. I want to use one more time before I go."
Mm.
And in the context of having referred back to this verse in our conversation, and she grew up as a Christian. Like, she had been in church since she was like 3. Sometimes the traditional way this text is used doesn't comfort, it gives permission.
Mm.
I'm for my seminary work right now, I'm reading a lot of different things, but I'm reading some Dallas Willard, which is always amazing. And I believe it was Dallas Willard who, talking about this text, said, if we believe this to be the normal Christian experience, it may be that we have lowered the bar too far.
Mm.
And I think that's what's happening here. I think in the use of this, for a host of reasons, Paul is saying this is not, as you just said, the normal Christian experience.
Yeah, which is a great segue for me to repeat exactly what Dr. Joey Dodson said at the end of their podcast. He made such a great point, and it bears repeating. This is not the normal Christian life. However,
Yeah.
if you as a Christian are following Jesus, you have prayed to receive Christ, you have devoted your life to him, and this is your experience. It may be that there is some trauma and some things that are going on in your life that are keeping you stuck, that it would be wise to seek out a wise Christian counselor to try to work through those things that live inside of you that make this feel real to you, despite the fact that this is not the normal Christian life experience. It might be a warning sign that you need to do some other work.
Yeah. Well, and the offering that I think this whole passage of Romans 6, 7, and 8 really all together offer are: don't give up. More is possible. You can have hope, not just hope that you're okay, but hope that life can be better than this, that you don't have to give up, that no matter how complicated it is, there is a path forward. I think that there's an offering, a fundamental offering of hope here.
Absolutely. I mean, I think that's exactly what we see in at the very end of chapter 7. Thanks be to God through Jesus Christ our Lord. There is hope. Jesus brought that hope. That's Paul's point.
Yeah. And I think Romans 8 both dives into that hope on a deep and profound level, and also has another one of these verses that is frequently misunderstood. Romans 8:28, right? We know that
Yes.
uh, for those who love God, all things work together for good for those who are called according to his purpose. I think we need to come back to Romans 8 and have a different discussion about what is going on there because there is a lot going on in Romans 8.
Yes. Yes. And for our astute listeners who will notice that Josh from Missouri teased that passage last week, we realized we could not record a conversation on Romans 8 until we had had a conversation on Romans 7. So we did them out of the order that we had promised. However, we hope that this really sets the stage well for our next conversation.
Yeah, I'm so excited to dive into Romans 8 and explore what if Romans 7 isn't supposed to be the norm, what is? But,
Yeah.
before we get into that, I would love to turn to our audience and just say, how have you typically read Romans chapter 7? What has it meant to you? What part has it played in your spiritual journey? We would love to hear whether it is the way that we evaluated it in our conversation today. We would love to hear how this has been meaningful to you up till now in your life, and perhaps how our conversation has shifted your thinking. And maybe we would even love to encourage you to use our conversation to spark a conversation about Romans 7 with a friend. There is nothing better than getting together with somebody who is on the same spiritual journey you're on and getting to dig in to a complex piece of the Bible for really inspiring you to move forward. So, and we would love to
Yeah.
hear about your conversations.
Yeah. Yeah. 100%. We love that. We get that glimpse from time to time of people that have started their own conversation using our conversations as a springboard. And that just, there's nothing better, honestly. It's great.
Exactly. Exactly.
Well, I think our conversation here on Romans 7 has been so good. We didn't leave ourselves time for any other thoughts.
That's exactly what I was about to say. We just got really excited about, you know, the Bible.
Yeah. Yeah. So I guess we still have to do the obligatory Which Josh
Oh, man.
because we just do.
And I'm so excited about this one because, you know, it's about miracles, and I love that. So this week's Witch Josh is which Josh has a daughter that caused an earthquake.
Okay. So this is me. I'm not sure that it was a miracle, but leave
Am
it to
I
the
overselling
charismatic
it?
to it. Well, you're just, you're being a little too charismatic about it. Like, come on, bring
Fair
it back
enough.
down to the Baptist level, if you would.
Okay,
Um,
well, we'll do that next in our conversation about Romans 8:28.
okay. All right. Yeah. Since you've really trashed the Baptist perspective today, man, I
What else
just
did
want to
I
hope.
say about Baptists today?
Well, the original outline from ChatGPT was a very Baptisty outline. So you kind of obliquely bashed us.
Oh, well, in my defense, I thought of it as very evangelical, not just Baptists, but
Is there any
all
other
right,
type of evangelical? Baptist,
not
we're
that you're
it,
aware
man.
of.
Yeah. Okay. All right. So my
Now
daughter
that's bashing
caused an earth.
Baptists.
Yeah, yeah, we got to move on. My daughter caused an earthquake. It was awesome. No, so my daughter's earthquake. Yes, this was the Taylor Swift concert. I can't believe Taylor Swift is coming up twice in one episode, but here we go. This was the Taylor Swift concert in Seattle that actually registered on the Richter scale. And there was a lot of publication around this because all of these fans were dancing to her music, and it literally caused a measurable earthquake in Seattle. And my daughter was there as a part of that, contributing to the seismic chaos that was the Taylor Swift Eras Tour.
I genuinely am awed and astounded that a human being gathered a large enough group of people and got them to dance, so much so that it had a geological impact.
Right?
That's just darn cool.
It really is. And very un-Baptist.
Also true. Though, from everything I've heard, Taylor Swift is, in fact, a good Baptist. That is what I understand to be true.
I can't tell if you're being facetious right now or
I
not.
am not telling the truth at all.
Okay. All right.
I don't think there is anything Baptist about her.
Okay. All right. Lest we get in trouble with Swifties, Baptists, and any other population that we may have denigrated, let's just talk again next week.
All right, let's do it. I'll talk to you then.
Okay. Bye-bye.